Welcome back. After announcing student debt relief for up to $20,000, President Joe Biden is now in the hot seat. The Biden administration is facing several lawsuits aimed towards blocking student debt relief. Joining me to discuss how this will affect the state of student debt relief is Senior Economist at LendingTree and student loan expert Jacob Channel. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I mentioned, the last time we spoke, student loan debt relief was up to $20,000. But that was a few months ago that we kind of heard this. Why is this process being slowed down?
Well, really, in I think the shortest words possible, it's because of a myriad of legal challenges. So, a lot of people, many different organizations or states or individuals have come forward and sued the Biden administration, effectively saying they don't think that the forgiveness that he's proposed is legal. And as a result of a lot of back and forth within the courts, there have been a lot of delays in actually implementing the plan.
Now, as you mentioned, there has been a lot of lawsuits, and we know about six so far that has been, presented to the Biden administration. Why are they being sued? I think it's just so strange to think that the president would do something that anybody would consider to be illegal. So, can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I think the thing to keep in mind is that, like economists, for example, economists like me, if you ask us, how's the economy doing, five different economists will probably give you different answers. In some instances, that's true of the law as well. Sometimes you can ask five different lawyers what their opinion is on an executive action or a law, and they might give you five different answers as to whether or not it's legal. So the Biden administration maintains that what it is doing is legal because of the HEROES Act, which was passed in 2003. However, there are a variety of people who argue that it is not legal. And so we've kind of got to wait for everything to move through the court system. It could eventually even go up to the Supreme Court, where they will finally decide once and for all whether or not this is legal. But regardless, right now, it really just boils down to a difference in opinions over whether or not this executive action is legal.
Now, on Monday, November 14th, a federal appeals court issued a nationwide injunction temporarily barring the Biden administration student loan debt relief program. What does this mean for those who have already applied for student loan debt or loan debt relief?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it really, at least in the short term, it means that nothing is probably going to happen insofar as you getting like a relief check or something like that. Because of this injunction, as well as another lawsuit from the 11th from a Texas judge, right now everything is pretty much on hold. The Biden administration, like I said earlier, they maintain that what they're doing is legal, so they are going to appeal this. So in the future, it's perhaps possible that we will eventually see the relief. But even if you apply, right now they're not even taking new applications. So as of right now, everything has really just been sort of stopped in its tracks while everything works its way through the court system.
So I want to mention that close to 26 million Americans have already applied for student loan forgiveness. But due to the nationwide block that took place on November 14th, does this mean those who have already applied will have to start, payments in January?
As things currently stand, the answer is probably yes, at least insofar as the Biden administration has announced that January will be the end date of the student loan payment pause, which has been in effect since March 2020. Now, with that said, I think that there is a pretty good chance that they're going to push that date back, at least while everything kind of works its way through the courts. I can't guarantee for sure they're going to do that, so everyone should prepare to resume making their payments when January comes around, and that means right now budgeting for those payments. But it is something that could potentially end up being delayed even further, just because everything is such a mess right now.
Now, I quickly want to say, did you possibly see this coming? Because I remember the last time we spoke, you did say that, you would advise people to start preparing to make some sort of payment. So can you just talk about, why you said that the last time and your thoughts on that now?
Certainly. So there are two big reasons. First, even if you qualified and did receive up to $20,000 worth of student loan debt forgiveness, there are a lot of people for whom that's not going to completely wipe out their balance. So they'd still owe money on something that was left over. However, the other thing is that I think based on how many of the courts in this country are made, based on who's sitting on them as judges, there are a lot of conservative judges. And from the get-go, conservatives weren't particularly thrilled about this executive action. So I think as a result, it was always probably going to be a very legally contentious battle between the Biden administration, between conservative groups who want to stop this executive action from going through. Again, I can't predict the future. I really wish I could say for certain, here's what's going to happen. But at least in the meantime, because everything is so up in the air, I always say you should hope for the best while preparing for the worst. And this is a great example of that. And in this case, preparing for the worst means preparing for your payments to resume, which is why you should be budgeting and paying attention to what you owe right now, so you're not blindsided if and when payments do start happening again.
Now, prior to the 14th, a few of the lawsuits were rejected due to lack of legal standing. Why were some of the lawsuits being rejected? And can you just talk a little bit more about, the background in that?
Yeah, so again, this kind of goes back to how different judges, different lawyers might have different opinions on what is or isn't legal or what does or does not have standing. Um, a lot of the earlier lawsuits, like you pointed out, were rejected because they didn't have legal standing. But because of how the appeals process works in this country, you can say, okay, this judge doesn't agree with me. I'm going to appeal to a higher court. Recently, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, when they issued their injunction, they also sort of hinted or said that they believe that there actually is standing in this case. So in that instance, they kind of overrule lower courts. Eventually, this could make its way up to the Supreme Court, and they will have the final say as to whether or not this does have standing or doesn't have standing. But again, like I said, this is one of those issues where there's just going to be different opinions, and that's sort of why we're not seeing a uniform response with regard to the question of standing.
So I want to talk about the difference of opinions in this country because many Americans have fought for, just student loan debt relief. But why are there so many people against this?
So there are a variety of reasons. For example, some people may be upset that they don't qualify for student loan debt forgiveness. Some people may be upset that they've already paid off their loans and they feel it's unfair that other people won't have to do the same thing. From a more legal perspective, some states may be suing, arguing that a lack of student loan debt interest will harm their revenue streams. Certain corporations may also be suing, saying if we can't offer people help with their student loan debt or the ability to qualify for other types of relief through our organization or something like that, then it could also affect their ability to hire people. So there are a wide variety of complaints about this forgiveness. Whether or not you think those complaints are valid is certainly a different question and something that people are going to have very different opinions on. But again, it's ultimately going to come down to probably, potentially what the Supreme Court has to say, what they think is valid and what they don't think is valid. Because if it does make its way up to the Supreme Court, they'll ultimately be the final word on this, regardless of what they have to say.
I also want to bring up the different parties because Republicans and Democrats are at odds when it comes to this, with both parties having opposing views on how this will affect the economy. Can you go into further detail about this?
Yeah, so the more conservative angle would say that because inflation is already so bad, if you're giving people extra money, like by forgiving their student loans, it could actually make inflation worse because people have more money to spend. On the other end of the spectrum, more left-leaning people might say that this is actually going to help people because it'll boost their savings, which is needed, especially in a period of high inflation. And also, it can help people better save for something like a down payment on a home. Because after all, if you're not making a student loan debt payment, you've potentially got a few hundred extra dollars a month that you could use for a variety of purposes. In terms of my personal view on this, I don't think that it's going to have, at least in the short term, a particularly profound effect on the economy. The reason for that is because payments have been paused since March 2020. Most people have not been making their student loan debt payments. So any extra money that they have has probably already been put in their bank accounts, has probably already been circulated in the economy. Once repayments resume, we might actually see a tiny little bit of a deflationary effect just because a lot of people are still going to make payments, and so there will be less money in the economy. In the longer term, I would probably err more on the side of this could potentially really help people, especially as it'll give them access to more cash they can use not only for basic necessities, but also to save up for things like I mentioned earlier, like a down payment or to pay off other higher interest debt. So I would say my opinion is probably more, this is probably more beneficial than not. But like I mentioned earlier, different economists might have slightly different viewpoints.
So I just want to clarify. You said that you think that it's not going to have like a huge effect. Is that necessarily like a good thing or a bad thing, or is it kind of in the middle?
I'd say it's probably kind of in the middle. So I should clarify again that it's probably not going to have a huge effect in the short term, just because the extra money that people won't be spending, they already haven't been spending because the payment has been on pause. Um, so I think that if anything else, it's probably not going to contribute to higher inflation, which is a good thing. With that said, depending on how much longer the court battles last, there could be other challenges. For example, some people might have issues making payments once they resume. So that could be kind of more of a bad thing. Um, and again, to reiterate, I think that in the longer term, if this really does go through, I think it would probably have a more positive effect than anything else, just because it'll give people access to more money that they can use for other important things, like I keep saying, like a mortgage or something like that.
Now, I know that a lot of stuff with this is changing so rapidly. Can you just let everybody know how they can actually stay up to date with this story and kind of know what's going on when it comes to student loan debt relief?
Yep, absolutely. So I think really the best way to do it is probably just to keep in to keep checking in on studentaid.gov. That's the government website for student aid for the Department of Education. They often, they'll post announcements there. If you've applied for debt relief, keep an eye out on your email. They'll be sure that it is from, a .gov address. Don't fall victim to scammers because they are out there, especially right now. So, I would say just keep an eye out on things. And the other bit of advice is, don't doom spiral. I know it can be really tempting when things aren't necessarily going your way, or everything's kind of in the air, to think, oh God, the world is ending. The reality is nobody knows for sure what's going to happen here. So right now, there's no sense in panicking about something that you can't control. Instead, like I mentioned earlier, just try to budget, try to figure out how you can make your payments. And if you think you're going to have trouble, do get in touch with studentaid.gov right now and figure out if you maybe qualify for other types of relief programs that are separate from this, or income-based repayment programs. Don't wait, because the longer you wait, the harder things are going to be if and when payments do resume.
All right, Jacob, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.